Hi, everyone. Welcome to the New York Times in Education webcast, Tips on How to Write Well. I'm Kathleen O'Connell, National Education Director at the New York Times. We would love to have you join the conversation. Simply type your questions into the space provided, and I will pass them on to our speaker. We're pleased to have New York Times reporter Sandy Keenan with us today. Sandy is a reporter for the home section here. Sandy, Ernest Hemingway had 4 tips for writing well. 1, use short sentences. 2, use short first paragraphs. 3, use vigorous English. And 4, be positive, not negative. So instead of inexpensive, use economical. Instead of painless, use little discomfort. What are your thoughts on Pappas' tips? And is there anything you would change or add?
Oh, there are lots of things. Actually, I went looking for lists in advance of this for my research, and I came up with lists of 50, lists of 17, funny lists that actually every suggestion shows you what the suggestion means, and so economical. There are no real tricks to writing, but the simplest ones are: don't use tired words and tired languages, cliches. Be simple, be direct, be as clear as you can be. I always like to tell people, pretend you're sitting at a bar and talking to your best friend. You're telling a story. And if they can't understand it, then no one can understand it. So simple is better. I agree with all those are on everybody's list. And I'm gonna get to one in a little bit. But first, I'd like to explain a little bit of my background and how varied it has been, even though I've mostly written for newspapers and magazines, the different kinds of writing I've done and how different it is to go from one to the other. And then we'll get into some concrete suggestions for how you can tackle writing and not be scared of it. You know, it can be terrifying to look at a blank computer screen and think, I have to fill that up. Even after all these years as a reporter, it still scares me to sit down at a screen and start writing, because first you have to really have something to say. I'm going to go quickly through my career so you guys have a sense of the kind of things I've done. I began out of college. I went to Northwestern University, and I went straight to the Miami Herald and was a sports writer. And back then there weren't many women sports writers. I went into locker rooms. I covered games. I ended up coming to New York soon after and working for Sports Illustrated and Newsday as a reporter. And I covered the Knicks. I covered baseball. And what's terrifying is you have to, in sports writing, you have to do it so quickly. I'd be covering a Knicks game, and at the buzzer, my story had to be finished. And then I'd run to the locker room, run back, throw a few quotes into it, and then that's what people would read the next day in the paper. So I had to be fast, concise, and have something to say, a theme, something interesting, something that I saw that sitting courtside, that the viewers at home watching it on TV didn't see, so that it would be something extra, not just seeing the game. From there, I moved on to being an editor, where I dealt with other people's work and did news and investigations, things that took much longer and more thoughtful, and in some ways were harder than writing quickly on deadline. So for many years I was an editor both of news and sports, and then I turned and became a year ago I had the opportunity to either keep editing or return to writing, and I returned to writing and was stunned to see after 13 years of not writing how very difficult it was. I was almost petrified. There's some comfort in taking someone else's work and making it better, and when it's almost like leaving yourself on the page when you have to write and put yourself out there. Now I have a really fun job, and I'm writing for the home section. And what I do, I joke that it's like speed dating, that I go into someone's home and I have to get to know them in the course of a few hours, and then be able to write about them with authority. You know, this couple I'm writing about this week, They met on Match.com, and he wore a bunny suit and she answered serious questions, and somehow it made a match. But that kind of detail, figuring out from them what it was that brought them together and how they decided to live this way, that's what makes for good writing. It's detail, things that unexpected detail, things that people wouldn't otherwise know. And so doing your research and figuring out what it is you have to say is really, in a lot of ways, the most important part about good writing. Because anybody can sit down and put words together, but you want to convey something. And the joy of my career has been that I've been able to do many forms of this. One thing I can't stand is to write about myself. I find it very weird and awkward, but some people are wonderful at it. As Frank McCourt, the great writer of Angela's Ashes, said once, "When in doubt, tell a story." And that's really what people like to read. So I was going to go through, I brought my own list. It's actually George Orwell's list of great writing, and I think I read through many lists, and I came up with his, and it seems to be the best of what I came up with. We'll go through it very slowly, and then we're going to go through sort of steps that you can try to improve your own writing. And like anything else in the world, writing is like, it's the more you do it, the more comfortable you get at it, and the better you get at it. If you're learning a sport or a musical instrument, practice always makes you better. And people sort of forget that. They think it's you're natural born as a writer, and no one is. That's what I love about it. It holds your attention, for 30 years, and I still will never be good enough. I'm always amazed when I read great writing.
It's like that joke, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And the
Practice,
punchline.
practice, right. Well, that's the truth. And the other thing is, it is humbling at times. You'll write a great piece and your editor will like it, and then the next week you'll write a piece and your editor will look at you and say, why don't we try a different approach? And so it's really challenging and hard, and people don't agree. It's a subjective subject, what makes for good writing. But let's get to Orwell's 5 rules. He had 5, not 4, and not 50, like some of the lists that I found. Never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. And a lot of times, these are, if someone has an axe to grind, if it's a hotbed of issues, these are tired phrases, things that, they just show that you aren't thinking or finding a new way to say something. The second rule is never use a long word where a short one will do. People misuse words. You should stick to what you're comfortable with and find a way to describe what you're trying to convey. And if it's too fussy, and you don't understand it, your reader will stop at it and probably put down whatever it is they're reading. If it is possible to cut out a word, always cut it out. You can go back and often when writers have word counts, and I know students have them often too, you have to write 500 words, and the best thing is to write 750 and then go back and see how many you can take out without losing thought in the story. Always a story gets better, or an article gets better by taking words out. And it's almost like a game. Once you get it all on the page, when you go back and look at it again and again, you can find things and say, I won't miss that. I won't miss that, nor will the reader. You want it to be clean, straightforward, as simple as possible. Never use the passive where you can use the active. The example that Orwell gives is the man was bitten by the dog. Was bitten is a very, very passive verbiage. It's much better to say the dog bit the man. That comes to sentence structure too. Sometimes you can write a sentence and look at it, and I try to do this. If it doesn't seem right, I try to write it 3 different ways, and then I pick the best one. It's almost like you stand back from it, and you become your own editor, and you decide, well, I started the last sentence that way, so let me try this a different way. And you back into it, or you try something new and different. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. this is interesting. It's like even the best science writing is so hard because it's taking difficult concepts and explaining them to people. I did a story this summer on passive houses, and it's such a hard complex to explain that, I mean, it's just so complex. But it took me forever, and even then my editor, I had to make sure she understood it, and by the time we got it done, it was so simple. There were no difficult words, but the concept, I hope, came across. And then he has a sixth rule, which is that break any of these rules sooner than saying anything outright barbarous. So he said, there are no real hard rules to writing. It just use common sense. Think about who you're writing for, and I don't mean your professor. Everybody jokes that you write for your professor. You're like, well, what does he like? Well, no. It's your writing, it's your voice, it's your personality you put out there. I use the analogy that it's like getting dressed. You decide if you're going to a party, you put on a certain outfit. And if you're hanging out with your friends, just on a Saturday afternoon, you wear something else. And stories are the same way. You have to think, what suits this story? As an editor once, we were doing a story on Lemony Snicket, who has a very particular style, formal style of writing, and the children did this, and it's very wry and funny. And I went to the reporter and I said, I want you to write this in the style of Lemony Snicket. And it was a wildly popular story because it was so funny. It was a play on the author, and you can do that. But sometimes you think, if you're covering the Knicks, you can write in an irreverent way. If you're if you're writing about why the president approved drilling in the Arctic, even though it's dangerous environmentally, you really have to be very careful and serious about how you go about presenting the information that you have. Elmore Leonard has one of his 10th rule, I love this, is try to leave out the part that readers tend to skip, okay? One thing that you should think about is what it is that go back and reread something that you loved and figure out why you can't put it down. In the same way, I always look for great writing in every walk of life. Stand-up comics are terrific at it. They go back and you know this from reading about them and listening to them. They tell the same routine time and again before different audiences. They try it this way, they try it that way, they slim it down, they speed it up, they take out lines. That's writing. That's great writing. And then over time it gets better, and you have to pull yourself back and be a little distance from it to try to read it as a reader would and not think, oh, this is great, I wrote it. A few things that we can go through, just some basic steps that I think that always help me. And that's when I'm facing a story and I've done all my research and I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do, what I'm going to write about. I never sit down and start writing until I have a sense in my mind the full scope of the story. What are the broad things that I want to say? And some people, it helps them to broadly outline a story, and other people just sort of have it in their head. But once you have a sense of, this is the arc of my story, these are all the points I want to make, this is the background I want to give, and then you sit down and you start writing. And the first requirement is you want to grab the reader and say, come along with me, sit and give this story some time. And a lot of times you can set a scene, you can surprise them, you can shock them, you can say something funny, and then the story unfolds. Always simply, it's as if you're talking. That's the best way to do it. I often, my husband makes fun of me, but I often read my stories out loud, because then you really hear how they sound. And if I get stuck just trying to read the sentence, imagine what somebody who hasn't written it what trouble they're going to have. So that's when you're getting started. Then, everybody has a different style. Some people like to go very slowly and do sentence by sentence. Some people like to do a brain drain where you just sit and let it all go and then fix it later. I'm sort of one of those people where if I can write it through and then you have to be a little loose and think, by the time you get to the end and then you look at it and you think, oh my God, the end is the beginning. And that's the beautiful part about word processing programs, Word, that you can take that draft, freeze it in time, save it, and then start a new one. And what I do when I revise my work is I email it to myself at different forms at different times of the day, and then I can find the various versions. Sometimes I number them. I'll say the name of the story 1, the name of the story 2, as I email it to myself. And the reason I do that is sometimes you'll revise something and then you step back and look at it and you think, oh my gosh, it was better the last time I did it. And so you can go dig that out and start again. So, revisions, simple language, looking it over and over and over, sometimes just moving yourself away from it, sleep on it for a night, get up in the morning, read it again, read it with fresh eyes, read it with an editor's eyes, and try to think you're someone else coming at it fresh. That's what I've learned after years of editing. It's kind of, you can actually be the writer and then you can be the story's editor at the same time. It's kind of a weird out-of-body experience. Anyway, I'm hoping that these things will help you. It's not hard to write. You should be relaxed. Think about what you want to tell. Try to be imaginative. Write with passion. Have something to say. That's really, in some ways, the best writing is when someone knows what they want to say when they sit down. And if you haven't read the book or you haven't interviewed the person, or it makes it very hard. The other thing I'd suggest, and it's a good practice, is as you look at other people's writing and try to think of it in the structure and style and how they went about this, it's good sometimes when the president is giving a speech or a baseball game is on, watch the game, watch the speech, and then sit down and think, how would I write it? What would I write about this? And what style would I do it in? And what form and how long would it be? And what would the tone be? And then in the morning, the fun is to open up the newspaper and see how other people did it. And that's how you can study writing, is to be a student of writing and look at it with a little bit of an more objective eye. Hope I have helped, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, and I hope you have questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. We do have a question. Does social media sites influence the style and substance of writing today?
Now that's funny, because I think of myself as a good writer, and I watch some of these. I watch Twitter, and I think, wow, I can't do that. I can't think in that way. So all of these, and my 20-something, one of my 20-something sons told me about a week ago. He said, Mom, you're the worst texter on earth. Everything has its own style. And the trouble is sometimes, and I see this in submissions to the newspaper, that people get in the habit of writing in loose and shorthand ways, and with language maybe that other people don't understand, or shortened acronyms. So you have to be careful. But I do like the quippy shortness of Twitter, and it is changing the way things are done. In some ways, and old fogies will say, it's ruining writing, and I say no, it's just changing it. And in some ways it's tighter writing and it's harder writing. It's hard to express yourself shorter, and that's what good writing is.
Great. We have another question. Does the New York Times provide a crash course on writing when someone joins the newsroom?
Most people, the crash course I think is the fine editing at the New York Times. That I can say that my editor, without fail, always makes me a better writer, and I really appreciate it. But most people who come here because they have experience as writers. We don't get too many people starting out. There are, the irony is that there is no crash course in writing. You can't. It's something that people have to take on themselves to get better at it. I can tell you what makes for good writing, but you have to do it. You have to sit down and try and put the time in. And it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of thought. And you get better as you go along, and it gets easier as you go along. So,
great. Okay, we have another question. Do you believe in keeping diaries as a form of writing?
I do, especially if you want to be an essayist or a novelist. I sort of shoot myself every now and then because I'll hear a funny exchange on the subway, or you'll see something funny and you'll think, I want to remember that. Maybe that could come in handy someday. You hear some very funny lines, and so yes, for mood and experience and timing, especially when you hear funny repartee and dialogue, it's great to write that down. So I admire people who do it, and in some ways regret that I haven't done it.
Great, thank you. We have another question. Thank you for your remarks. You mentioned writing a story of, say, a sports event and comparing it with what the Times reporter writes the next day. Is there another technique you can recommend?
Well, I do this routinely. It's editor training. When I read an article through, especially something really interesting, and I'll get to the end, and I'll always look at it as a whole, and I'll think, what would I have started with? And a lot of times and this happens as an editor, you get through 3/4 of a story, and you have an aha moment, and you think, oh my gosh, this is buried all the way down here. I would have started with it, and so that's what critical reading is, to look at something and say, oh my, you can enjoy it the way it's done, and then you can step back and think, could it have been better? How could I have done it better? A lot of times, you don't want to take your best element and put it at the top, but you might want to tease to it. That makes for good writing. There's all sorts of drama and form, and that's what, like I said, that's what makes it all so inviting, is that there's no right or wrong way to do it. There are some simple rules to follow. I wanted to say in my speech, and I forgot, there are some simple books that you can get if you were falling asleep during grammar and coming up, or you just can't remember it. There's a book called Woe Is Me, and it's all about grammar and usage, and it's quite readable. Even I can understand it. It's also The Elements of Style by Strunk and White. Is just simple book. It's a very small, simple language, and it reminds you of all these things. And I would say once a year I get those books out, and I just thumb through them and remind myself that good writing is active verbs, it's simple language, it's explaining only when you think the reader needs it. It's showing, not always telling, with a combination of both. Anyway, more?
Another question. Would you suggest free writing and visual mapping for getting unformed ideas down on paper?
Yes. I keep after I report a story, it's funny. I almost never sit right down and write it, because you just want it. You want it to sit in your. You want to play with it in your mind for a few days, thinking. Once and it applies to term papers and other things. You want to think about it, what's important, and remove yourself from it in a little way to think of it as a puzzle that you're putting together, and how are you going to tell it. So I do that. That's what I was talking about. Go for a jog or walk around the block when you're and remove yourself from all the noise that's in our lives, and try to think what's the best way and most inventive way to tell it. I keep a pad and a pencil. I don't journal, but I keep a pad and pencil next to my bed, because sometimes I wake up with and I don't want to forget it in the morning. Here's a lead I could try. So yes, those are great ideas. It really is my most important rule, that until you know what you want to say, don't start writing. So.
Great. Thank you, Sandy. That's all we have time for.
Oh,
but
wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much
Wonderful.
for inviting me.